This is Rummy's Corner. Ever since the controversial draw between Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, I've seen an awful lot of boxing fans questioning the validity of Tyson Fury's claim to the lineal heavyweight world championship. This actually all started before the fight, but it seems far more widespread now since the draw. And honestly, I'm a little baffled that so many fans are attempting to discredit Fury on his claim. When you consider the rich history of the heavyweight championship, I've yet to see a compelling argument against Fury's valid claim to the lineage. No matter which way you slice it, Fury is undeniably the man to beat right now in any historical context. And if we look through our heavyweight history, there are several historical precedents that reinforce this fact. John L. Sullivan is the man who has widely been identified as the first heavyweight world champion. The lineal championship is dated back to him for well over a century. Now, a lot of boxing historians will point to the fact that Jem Mace had a legitimate claim as world heavyweight champion, and there is definitely truth in that, but that's a discussion for another day. For our purposes here, John L. Sullivan was the first lineal champion, and the entire heavyweight lineage, the man who beat the man, it can all be traced back to Sullivan. Tracing the lineage is a tricky business. It's not an exact science, but with the heavyweight division, things are relatively straightforward. Sullivan lost the title to Gentleman Jim Corbett. Corbett lost the title against Bob Fitzsimmons, and Fitzsimmons lost against James J. Jeffries. And after making 7 defenses of the title, Jeffries retired. So this represented the first break in the lineage. And at this time, there was no historical precedent for crowning a new champion. Ultimately, Marvin Hart defeated former conqueror Jack Root in a bout that Jeffries himself had refereed, and Hart became the new champion. Hart would go on to lose against Tommy Burns, and Burns would go on to lose against Jack Johnson, the former champion who was pardoned earlier this year by President Trump. But a lot of people didn't recognize Johnson's claim to the championship, and a lot of that was racially motivated. These were different times, and Tommy Burns was actually the first heavyweight champion to ever defend the title against an African American challenger. So Jack Johnson winning the heavyweight championship, this was historically significant and unprecedented. I mean, this was nearly 40 years before Jackie Robinson broke the color line in Major League Baseball. So racial motivation definitely played a strong role in all of this, but there were also many observers who felt that Hart and Root should never have been given the opportunity to fight for the vacant title in the first place. And again, at this time there was no historical precedent here. But when Jeffries came out of retirement after more than 5 years, Jack Johnson had settled matters once and for all. Johnson dominated Jeffries and ultimately scored a 15th round knockout. This solidified Jack Johnson's claim to the lineal heavyweight championship. Any way you slice it, Johnson's claim is historically beyond reproach. Johnson would eventually go on to lose against Jess Willard, and Willard would eventually go on to lose against Jack Dempsey, and Dempsey lost against Gene Tunney. After 2 title defenses, Tunney retired, and this represented another break in the lineage. With the vacancy, top contenders Max Schmeling and Jack Sharkey battled it out for the vacant title, and Schmeling won the championship when Sharkey was disqualified for a low blow. The next point of interest in our journey through the lineage involved Joe Louis. Louis retired as champion after having made a record 25 title defenses. But that retirement was short-lived because Joe Louis was having problems with an IRS audit. So Louis ultimately had no choice but to return to boxing. During his brief retirement, Ezzard Charles had defeated Jersey Joe Walcott to become the new heavyweight champion. And when Louis came out of retirement after being out of action for more than 2 years, Ezzard Charles defeated Joe Louis by 15-round unanimous decision, thus solidifying his claim to the lineage in a situation that has similarities with Johnson's victory over Jeffries more than 40 years earlier. Any way you sliced it, Ezzard Charles had a legitimate claim to the lineal heavyweight world championship. Our next historical point of reference is when Rocky Marciano retired as champion, and matters were settled there when top contenders Archie Moore and Floyd Patterson battled it out, and Patterson became champion when he stopped the old mongoose in round 5. Next, we have the situation with Muhammad Ali, when he had his boxing license revoked. During Ali's absence, Joe Frazier emerged as the new heavyweight champion when he defeated Jimmy Ellis in a unification bout between the two top active heavyweights. That was in February 1970. A few months later, Ali was granted a boxing license again, and he returned to the ring in October of that year after an absence of more than 3 years. This all paved the way to the fight of the century, the very first classic meeting between Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali. And this represented a very unique situation in heavyweight history where Frazier and Ali were both undefeated and they both held legitimate claims to the heavyweight world championship. After 15 hard-fought rounds of sheer action, Frazier was awarded a 15-round unanimous decision, and this solidified Frazier's claim to the heavyweight lineage. Joe Frazier's claim was now beyond reproach, just like Ezzard Charles and Jack Johnson before him. Several years later, after regaining the heavyweight championship for a record 3rd time, Muhammad Ali retired, but this was another short-lived retirement. During Ali's absence, Larry Holmes defeated Ken Norton for the vacant WBC title, and after Holmes had made several defenses, Ali came out of retirement to challenge Holmes. The Eastern Assassin proceeded to dominate Ali, and this was the victory that cemented Larry's claim to the lineal championship. Please note that there is a vocal minority faction that questions Holmes' valid claim to the lineage, and these claims are all predicated on the idea that Ali retired. But when Ali retired after beating Spinks, this wasn't his first retirement. Ali actually had several short-lived retirements before this during the later parts of the 1970s, and the people who try and discredit Larry's claim because of Ali's retirement, they never include his previous short-lived retirements in a discussion of starting a new lineage. So make no mistake, Larry Holmes' claim is as valid as they come. It's beyond reproach, just as it was in the previous situations we covered involving Joe Frazier, Ezzard Charles, and Jack Johnson. But the Holmes example leads us to another interesting situation. When Larry eventually lost a controversial decision against Michael Spinks, Spinks had become the man. And this was during an era where the sanctioning alphabet bodies were starting to approach modern form. And all of this coincided with the rise of Iron Mike Tyson. And Tyson would go on to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history, and he would also go on to unify all 3 major world titles of his day: the WBC, the WBA, and the IBF. Spinks had been stripped of the IBF title he'd won against Holmes. So in this instance, Tyson held all 3 major world titles, but Michael Spinks still had a legitimate claim as the lineal champion. Tyson, of course, settled matters when he stopped Spinks in 1 round, but this historical example dispels the myth I frequently see being cited, which incorrectly claims that becoming undisputed starts a new lineage. It doesn't. It's simply not true. Iron Mike Tyson never held a legitimate claim to the lineage until after he beat Michael Spinks. And that's an important point to remember here. When 45-year-old George Foreman shocked the world to become the oldest heavyweight champion in history when he stopped Michael Moore with a brutal right hand, another noteworthy ordeal soon surfaced. When Foreman regained the heavyweight crown, he also earned himself a couple of alphabet titles, but he was ultimately stripped by the WBA and IBF despite never losing either title in the ring. So George's claim to the lineage was still legit, even though Big George no longer possessed a major world title. Foreman would ultimately go on to lose a controversial decision against Shannon Briggs, and Briggs would go on to get stopped by Lennox Lewis. Lennox retired as champion, and we had another break in the lineage And this one was quite a long vacancy until Vladimir Klitschko took the throne. After Lewis retired, Vitaly Klitschko was the one who seemed to be the frontrunner to the throne. And Vitaly was widely considered the best heavyweight for a short stretch after that. But Vitaly never beat the guy who was considered the second best at that time, a man who also defeated him previously, Chris Bird. Now, had Vitaly not retired, where he was having all sorts of injury troubles, and there were a couple of postponed bouts with Hasim Rahman, Vitaly may well have emerged as the lineal champion. But it never happened, and during Vitaly's 4-year absence, his younger brother Vladimir had become the dominant heavyweight force. By the time Vitaly came back after being out of action for nearly 4 years, Vladimir would soon go on to defeat Ruslan Chagayev, which gave Vlad a really strong claim to the lineage. Now, some people might argue that Chagayev wasn't the rightful number 2 guy at the time, even though he was generally viewed as such. But even if you don't view that win as the pivotal moment, Vlad had a long and dominant reign, and surely his win against Alexander Povetkin seals it by the end of 2013. Vitaly had since retired again by then, and Klitschko and Povetkin were the 2 top-rated heavyweights at that time. So any way you slice it, Vladimir's claim was legitimate, so when Tyson Fury scored his dominant victory against Vladimir back in November 2015, Fury became the lineal heavyweight world champion. Tyson Fury never lost in the ring, and he is still the man to beat. Plain and simple. Let's dissect the 4 main claims against Fury and discredit each and every one of them. Number 1, for starters, any claim that Fury can't be considered the lineal champion because he doesn't hold a major world title, those claims are null and void. We have historical precedent here in the examples of both Michael Spinks and Shannon Briggs. Then number 2, we have some people claiming that Fury can't be considered the lineal champion because Anthony Joshua holds 3 alphabet titles. Those claims are also bunk. And again, we have another historical precedent here. This one set by Iron Mike Tyson, when he held 3 major world titles of his day, but Michael Spinks was still viewed as the lineal heavyweight champion. Number 3, we also have claims that Tyson Fury was, quote, stripped of the lineal title because he had his boxing license revoked. But once again, this claim doesn't hold much weight. And we have another historical precedent in the situation involving Muhammad Ali. Because of the circumstances surrounding Ali when his license was revoked, Joe Frazier's claim was always going to have a big question mark around it. But Frazier cemented his lineal status when he defeated Ali in the fight of the century. And finally, number 4, the claim that Tyson Fury said he retired, and that by retiring, he surrendered his claim to the lineal championship. This again is clearly incorrect. While it's true that when a heavyweight champion retires, a new lineage is formed when the 2 top contenders square off, but there are only 3 instances of this in an historical context that are applicable: Gene Tunney, Rocky Marciano, and Lennox Lewis. Those 3 retired as champions and never attempted comebacks. But during Fury's absence, the 2 guys who emerged as the best, Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua, they never fought. So neither Wilder nor Joshua has any type of valid claim here, regardless of which alphabet titles they hold. But more importantly, we do have a handful of examples where a short-lived retirement was historically insignificant in the context of this greater discussion. Larry Holmes solidified his claim when he defeated Muhammad Ali after Ali's short-lived retirement. Ezzard Charles cemented his claim when he defeated Joe Louis after Joe's short-lived retirement. And Jack Johnson put his claim beyond reproach when he defeated James J. Jeffries after a not-so-short-lived retirement. And one final point here. I also sometimes see the ridiculous claim that if Lennox Lewis came back now, that he'd still have to be considered the lineal heavyweight champion. Well, there is no historical precedent there. I mean, Lewis hasn't fought professionally in more than 16 years, whereas Tyson Fury was only out of action for 2.5 years. Big difference there. And once again, history is on Tyson Fury's side. When you look and consider all of these various historical precedents here, and the great abundance of supporting evidence, Tyson Fury is clearly the man to beat. Fury is the legitimate lineal heavyweight champion of the world, and until Deontay Wilder, or Anthony Joshua, or some other heavyweight beats Tyson Fury inside the squared circle, Tyson Fury's claim to the lineage will continue to be legit. Make no mistake, Tyson Fury is still the lineal heavyweight world champion. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed, and have a great night.